President,
Right, Whip?
are we in a quorum call?
We're not.
No, we're not.
No, we're not.
Thank you. Mr. President, Friday marks the deadline to fund the Department of Homeland Security. Last week, Congress, House and Senate, passed the 5 outstanding bipartisan government appropriation bills that funded 96% of the federal government. Senate Democrats drew the line when it came to funding this department, the Department of Homeland Security. After what we had seen in Minneapolis, in Chicago, and so many other places, we successfully removed that bill from government funding package to allow for negotiations with respect to federal immigration enforcement agents and their operations. Republicans have had a week to work with Democrats to reform ICE and the Border Patrol and rein in the campaign of terror we've witnessed in Chicago, Minneapolis, and across the country. I'm sorry to say we've made little progress in reaching an agreement. The administration's campaign of terror has led to the detention of innocent people, serious injuries, and deaths, including those of Alex Preddy and Renee Good in Minneapolis, both American citizens who were exercising their constitutional rights to observe and protest ICE enforcement. Americans are seeing this chaos play out in countless videos, and they're demanding change. President Trump has justified these militarized immigration enforcement operations as targeting the worst of the worst, and quote, murderers, rapists, terrorists, the criminally insane. But the statistics of the Department of Homeland Security tell a much different story, the real story. New reporting from CBS News shows that less than 14% of the nearly 400,000 immigrants arrested by ICE in 2025 had charges or convictions for violent criminal offenses. The president was railing at his rallies. We're going after the murderers, the terrorists, the rapists, the child abusers. And then take a look at the numbers. Less than 14% of the 400,000 immigrants arrested by ICE in 2025 had charges for convictions for violent crimes and offenses. And this data from DHS indicates that only 2% of those arrested by ICE over the past year have any alleged gang affiliations. 2%. Nearly 40% of all those arrested by ICE in 2025 did not have any criminal record at all. None. And that's the truth of the matter. These militarized immigration enforcement operations are not really designed to lock up the worst of the worst. They are designed to sow fear in a community. I saw it Saturday. St. Pius V Church in Little Village in the city of Chicago, an Hispanic community. The people all wore masks and were very careful where they walked and when they went shopping, when they went to a restaurant, when they went to church. That's the climate of fear that's been created by this operation. Removing dangerous criminals, 2%. 2% of those arrested and detained and separated from their families had any criminal background. And while Operation Metro Surge in Minnesota has been in the national spotlight recently, the city of Chicago, as I mentioned, is no stranger to Trump's campaign of terror. Last week, I also attended a Democratic forum examining Department of Homeland Security's use of violence in immigration enforcement operations. There I learned what happened to a 30-year-old Montessori school teacher, Miramar Martinez. Listen to this story and tell me that ICE is focusing on terrorists. Miramar Martinez, on a Saturday morning, decided to take some spare clothing in her closet to her local church to give to people who might need it. She got in her car, drove over to her church. Miramar Martinez is a United States citizen. She was born and raised in Chicago. What happened to her? ICE confronted her on a major street in Chicago on that Saturday morning. And when she drove away, they fired and it hit her 5 times. 5 times they shot her. A CBP agent during the Trump administration's Operation Midway Blitz. 5 times. She's lucky to be alive. Ms. Martinez described that moment in her opening statement. She said, "I struggle with the memories of it every day, the shots ringing out and the burning sensations as the bullets ripped through my skin and body." What crime is she guilty of? Taking spare clothing to her church on a Saturday morning. Good enough for ICE to fire away. The fact that Ms. Martinez is alive today after being shot 5 times is a miracle. I told her as much. But immediately after the shooting of Mr. Martinez, the agent, I won't say his name, we know what it is, the agent of CBP, a 23-year veteran, went on his cell phone and bragged about his shooting abilities in private text to fellow agents. He wrote, and I quote, "I fired 5 rounds and she had 7 holes in her body. Put that in your book, boys." He was so proud of himself. He shot this woman, this 30-year-old Montessori teacher, 5 times. What happened to the van that they allege she rammed into, causing this shooting incident? Mysteriously, it disappeared from the scene. The ICE van was taken away. Well, where would they take the ICE van? They took it to Maine, 1,000 miles away from Chicago. Why Maine? That happened to be where the agent lived. But it also was an effort to cover up the actual evidence of what happened that day. You see, there was no indication on the van, the body of the van, that she rammed into it, and she did not. There was no evidence whatsoever. But they removed the evidence. So what happened when they brought the charges in court against Miramar Martinez for ramming into the ICE van and for defying the agents? What happened to those charges? They were all dropped. 5 times that woman was shot on the streets of Chicago, and when it came to pressing charges, the government dropped all charges against her. Ms. Martinez, a teaching assistant to little kids, spoke of the trauma she continues to carry with her. Quote, "The physical scars will always be there in the mornings and evenings. When I get dressed and I stare at my body, I'm now permanently disfigured by the 5 bullet holes." She continued, quote, "There will be time this summer when I head to the beach with my dogs and family. There will be there when I get down on the floor with the students. That shooting will be with her the rest of her life." They dropped all charges. They removed the van that was involved in this incident 1,000 miles away and repainted it. Does Ms. Martinez sound like the worst of the worst? Does she sound like a murderer, a rapist, a terrorist, criminally insane? Of course not. Why are we letting this happen in America? For goodness sakes, the Constitution is clear. There are guarantees people have of their own freedom and liberty. My friends on the other side of the aisle look past that. They don't want to talk about it. I'm afraid I can't stop talking about it because what happened to her is totally unjust. So now we're trying to change the scene. We're doing this because what happened to her must stop. That's why Senate Democrats are setting to rein in ICE and CBP. Last week, leaders Schumer and Jeffries laid out our reforms to federal immigration enforcement in writing. All we're asking is that ICE and other federal immigration agents adhere to reasonable standards to maintain trust, safety, and accountability in our communities. So what specifically are we demanding? First, stop these roving patrols. The United States is a nation governed by the rule of law. Government agents cannot indiscriminately round up people without probable cause, and they can't break down the doors of someone's home and disappear them without a judicial warrant. Did you see the video in Minneapolis when they broke down the door of one of these families? The man was taking a shower. He wrapped a towel around himself and in freezing weather was dragged out to the ICE vehicle. Turns out they knocked down the wrong door. They identified the wrong person. They crashed his door, invaded his home, and had no basis for doing so whatsoever. Government agents cannot indiscriminately round up people without probable cause, and they can't be breaking down the door of your home. There is an amendment to the Constitution which was written specifically to protect us from this sort of government behavior. Second, there needs to be accountability, including new use of force standards that allow local law enforcement to participate in investigating complaints of excessive force by immigration agents. Do you think if there was an investigation of the shooting of Miramar Martinez, that they'd allow the vehicle that was involved, ICE vehicle involved, to be removed 1,000 miles away from Chicago and repainted before any hearing? Of course not. And there should be no immigration enforcement operations at sensitive locations like hospitals, schools, churches, courts, and polling places. Finally, we're asking that body cameras be mandatory and masks come off. Masks off, cameras on. Virtually every professional law enforcement department in my state and the nation has accepted that standard, all except for ICE. They want to be secret police, secret paramilitary, and they want to wear masks to hide their identity. What are we doing in this country? Democrats are united in our calls for these common sense reforms. The American people back us up on every single one of them. This week, we need the Republicans to work in good faith to get the deal done. In the meantime, I want to note something. Secretary Noem, she's on television a lot, hasn't she? Paid ads as well as her own appearances. She has not appeared once before the Senate Judiciary Committee in the last year. When I've asked repeatedly of the chairman of that committee to bring her in for an accountability session, he's tried with no luck. She says she's too busy to appear before the Senate Judiciary Committee and explain the lethal mismanagement of her agency and the damage that's being done. She says now she may come in a few weeks if she's not too busy, I might add, and if she still happens to be the secretary of that department. The administration must end this aggressive immigration enforcement surge and mass deportation campaign. ICE and federal agents need to play by the same rules as professional police forces across America. That's the bottom line. If your police force in your town and your state can do its job without wearing a mask on the job, can do the job with a video camera recording what actually happened at an event, why in the world are these federal agencies treated any differently? Why are they given special privileges? So they can arrest 2% of the people that they're looking for? That's not a very enviable record. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Quorum call. Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, funding for the Department of Homeland Security runs out on Friday. Over the weekend, the Trump administration and congressional Democrats engaged in meaningful talks on a path forward. And Democrats have made their demands known in detail. Some of them are positive starting points for further discussion. Others are non-starters and unnecessarily tie the hands of law enforcement. In the coming days, the administration and Democrats will need to work out their differences. And I expect that the Trump administration, with the full backing of congressional Republicans, will continue to resist any effort to make it harder for law enforcement to detain and deport dangerous illegal aliens, which is what many of the Democrats' demands would do. And I expect that the administration, again, with the backing of Republicans here in Congress, will insist on reforms of its own. I expect that those will include changes aimed at protecting federal law enforcement officers who are increasingly under threat from an organized and well-funded campaign to undermine immigration enforcement efforts. Equally important is addressing cooperation, or the lack thereof, between local and federal law enforcement. Too many jurisdictions prohibit local police from cooperating with immigration enforcement, a policy that not only defies common sense, but makes things more dangerous for everyone. And so I hope that my Democrat colleagues are prepared to talk about these and other issues. Mr. President, as in any good faith negotiation, there will be some back and forth. We've already seen the Trump administration act in good faith. Last week, Tom Homan announced an agreement to draw down 700 federal agents in Minnesota, something made possible thanks to increased cooperation from local law enforcement. The Trump administration has already said it will deploy body cameras to all officers deployed in Minneapolis. And as I've mentioned before, Republicans previously agreed to provide additional money for body cameras and de-escalation training for immigration and customs enforcement officers in a bipartisan, full-year Homeland Security bill. But Democrats reneged on that deal. Going forward, it is my hope that Democrats will work constructively and honor their commitments, because Republicans are serious about getting this funding bill done. That's one of the reasons we wanted to provide more time for negotiations. We're just a few days away from the deadline that Democrats chose, and it's very possible we won't have our work finished by then. If Democrats are serious about finding a solution here, they may need to find more time to bring these efforts to a productive conclusion. Mr. President, a government shutdown, even one that affects just one agency, is not in anybody's interest, least of all that of the hardworking Americans who staff these agencies and the American people who depend on their important work. As Roll Call reported, the Coast Guard is awaiting funding, and I quote, for new cutter and icebreaker ships, plus new helicopters and drones, not to mention higher spending on day-to-day missions, end quote, in the full-year bill. DHS oversees cybersecurity missions. That, if not fully funded, would leave America vulnerable to cyber attack. FEMA is a DHS agency, and it needs certainty to be able to both prepare for and respond to natural disasters. And then there's the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, which provides instruction for federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement officers, not to mention for our own Capitol Police. So, Mr. President, I could go on about the important work that falls under the Department of Homeland Security and the need to pass a full-year bill to fund the entire department. But I'll leave it here, Mr. President. We need to keep working toward a solution. And if it's going to take longer than a few days, we need to provide the time necessary to finish the job. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alston-Brooks. Mr. President,
Senator from Alabama.
I ask to suspend the quorum.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following interns in my office be granted floor privileges until May the 1st, 2026. Brianna Puchel, Robbie Roos, and Susanna Jackson. Thank you. Mr. President, let me take you back to November 2024. President Trump and his family were together in Florida awaiting the election results after one of the most brutal campaigns in American history. 4 years earlier, President Trump had been forced to leave the White House after rampant voter fraud had resulted in Joe Biden being elected president. In 2022, President Trump announced he would run again in 2024, much to the Democrats' dismay. The mainstream media went into full meltdown, claiming it was impossible for President Trump to return to the White House. During Trump's campaign, he was shot live on television, arrested on made-up charges, and even had his home raided by the FBI. But he was still standing and determined as ever to get back to the White House and finish what he had started. Thankfully, 77 million people, Americans, agreed, helping President Trump win both the Electoral College and the popular vote. Americans also gave Republicans control of the House and Senate to help President Trump accomplish his agenda. This historic victory on November the 5th, 2024 wasn't just about President Trump, however. It was also a rejection of the Democrats' ridiculous open border policies that had allowed tens of millions of illegals to come into our country unvetted. It was a rejection of the sky-high inflation that made life unaffordable for millions and millions of Americans. It was a rejection of the woke policies like men and women's sports, allowing to perform life-ruining surgeries on children. And it was a rejection of the weaponization of the federal government to go after political opponents. November the 5th, 2024 was one of the most consequential elections of my lifetime. It paved the way for Republicans in the House and the Senate to deliver historic tax cuts. Just last summer, with popular cuts to Social Security, tips, and overtime. We look forward to seeing all those policies take effect this year, but we still have much work to do. There's been a lot of talk in the media about what Republicans need to focus on into the midterms later this year. A lot of talk. If you ask me, the number one issue must be securing our elections. If we don't deliver on this, we will lose our country to the woke globalists who hate our Constitution and want to destroy the greatest nation on earth. It's far past time for my Republican colleagues in the Senate to stop worrying about getting reelected and pass one of the most critical pieces of legislation that we will see in our lifetime, the Save America Act. The Save America Act is most important. It requires voters to show a government ID to vote in federal elections. What a thought. This is common sense, which is, by the way, 83% of all Americans, they support it, according to a 2025 poll just a few weeks ago. There is bipartisan support for it. 95% of Republicans and 71% of Democrats across this country agree that a photo ID should be used in all of our elections. Interestingly, the support also transcends demographics among American citizens. 82% of Latino voters, 76% of black voters, 85% of white voters favor photo ID. This really isn't complicated. The Save America Act also requires proof of citizenship for an individual to register in your state. If you are here illegally, you should not be voting in our elections, period. Lastly, the bill requires states to remove non-U.S. citizens from existing voter rolls. It makes sense. These policies, they're not controversial, yet the Democratic Party is throwing a tantrum. You should be asking yourself, why is that? Why are they against voter ID, no mail-in ballots, no ballot harvesting, and one-day voting? Why is that? Is it because their illegal voting base will no longer be able to keep them in power once the legislation becomes law? Sure it is. Democrats claim the Save America Act is a voter suppression. It's racist, but the American people, they're not falling for it. Don't believe the mainstream media's portrayal of this. The American people have already spoken. The Save America Act is a huge majority of Americans, and they want it. There are many things in our day-to-day lives that require us to show a government photo ID. Many things, almost everything. Purchasing alcohol, lottery tickets, tobacco products, boarding flights, renting a car, checking into hotels. If you want to open up a bank account or apply for credit, you must show a photo ID. Marriage license, signing legal documents. Many other benefit programs often require proof of identification as well. Not to mention, my Democrat colleagues in the Senate are supporting ICE agents to prove their identities while deporting criminals. Let federal law enforcement agents do their job, folks. Let them do their job. The hypocrisy from the radical left knows no bounds. Ask yourself, why is it easier to vote than it is to board a plane? Makes no sense. Why are Republican politicians in Washington ignoring the mandate of 77 million American patriots? 77 million voted to get this done. Washington, D.C., we got problems where elected officials are completely out of touch and they don't listen to the people they represent. They vote for themselves, and that's gotten us in trouble. They're more concerned about getting reelected than actually doing what they promised to do on the campaign trail. It's easy to talk, but you need to follow up on what you ran on. For years, Democrats have shouted from the rooftops that it is impossible for illegals to vote in our elections, but the proof is in the pudding. August 2024, Texas Governor Greg Abbott, he announced that they found more than 1 million ineligible voters on the Texas voter rolls. 1 million. In October 2024, the Supreme Court of the United States approved the state of Virginia to remove 1,600 ineligible voters from the voter rolls. Had to be forced to do it. Earlier this year, Oregon was forced to begin removing 800,000 inactive voters from the state registration rolls. Why do they have to be told to do that? It doesn't make any sense. This is not a coincidence. It is an intentional political strategy being orchestrated by the Democratic National Party. Democrats, they've lost their traditional blue-collar and minority voter base. How do we know that? Majority of them just voted for President Trump just a year ago. Because of that, the Democrats have now found themselves a new girlfriend. Who are they? Illegal immigrants. That's why the Democrat-controlled states refuse to work with the Department of Justice and have denied the agency access to the voting rolls. Denied the federal government, oh, you can't see our voting rolls. What do you got to hide? They'd rather fall on their swords for criminal illegal aliens, murderers, rapists, and terrorists to get their votes than prioritize the safety of American citizens. Thanks to the Director of National Intelligence, Director Tulsi Gabbard, Americans are finally seeing evidence of the past fraudulent elections come to light. Millions of Americans have thought for years that there was serious election interference in Fulton County, Georgia during the 2020 presidential election. Thanks to President Trump, FBI Director Kash Patel, and DNI Tulsi Gabbard, the 2020 presidential election ballots have been seized and will soon reveal the real truth to the American people. The Save America Act must be our main priority this year. and the saving, and that's saying a whole lot because we have got a lot of problems up here, but it's got to be our #1 priority. For instance, Washington, D.C. has a serious spending problem. You know, we're more than $38 trillion in debt with nothing to show for it. Or look at the fact that we are one of the sickest countries on earth. Thank God for RFK Jr. and Make America Healthy Again movement. We are working to address this problem, not to mention all the problems created by the Biden administration in their office for 4 years. But we can't even start addressing these problems until we pass the Save America Act. We have to do it. Luckily, we still have time to get it to the finish line. One way we can do this is to get rid of the outdated 60-vote filibuster. The way it is used today has nothing to do with what it was originally intended for. Instead of the zombie filibuster of today, it's become a tool of obstruction used to overturn the will of the American people. We don't work for the Senate. We work for the American people. The filibuster was set up to allow debate, and that should be happening right here. Real debate on this floor. My Democrat colleagues need to come to the floor and explain to the American people why they want illegals to vote in elections. I'd like to hear it. What's their reasoning? President Trump ran on the common sense policies of Save America Act, and he won also the popular vote, by the way. It's time my Republican colleagues started acting like we were in the majority. We have the power. As Republicans, we currently have 53 seats in the Senate. Clearly, the American people are behind us and support the American First agenda. That's exactly why 77 million people voted in 2024, and we owe it to each and every one of them to get the job done and just sit up here and look at each other. Passing legislation like the Save America Act is essential for the future of our country. We're not going to have another chance. We have no choice. We've got to get it done. If we do not pass this bill, we may never have a secure election in this country again. Never. That's a long time. Democrats will work overtime to import as many illegals to this country as they can. They just showed they'd do it for 4 months or 4 years. We can't allow that to happen again. We are seeing the Democrat strategy play out in real time in other countries as we speak. I've been saying this for years. All you got to do is go to Europe. They're us 10 years from now if we don't pass the Save America Act. It's gone. Their leaders are getting fired right and left. They've lost their moral values, they lost their culture, and they lost their country. All it started with mass migration, which they have allowed to completely destroy what they've had for centuries. The socialist-controlled Spanish government recently imported 500,000 migrants and are in the process of granting residency. You got to be kidding me. Or look at Romania, where the conservative pro-Romania First candidate was cheated out of a victory in 2024 because of made-up claims that Russia had interfered in their elections. Sounds familiar. If we don't pass the Save America Act this year, what's happening in Europe won't just be overseas anymore. It's going to be right here in our backyard, because many of the enemy are already inside the gates. Politicians often warn about the crime or national security threats that illegals pose to this country, but this isn't just about American safety. It's also a serious financial problem. You know that every year now we're having to pay for the illegals that are in this country. It costs you and me and every taxpayer in this country $150 billion. What could we do with that money in our states, in our communities, in our neighborhoods? Folks, we have to take our country back. Our borders, we have to take it all back before it's too late. We must get rid of the Dominion voting machines, stop mail-in voting, absentee ballots only in certain situations, stop ballot harvesting, and return the same-day only voting. In my state of Alabama, I get 2 questions. Are you going to close the border, and are you going to have fair elections? I want my vote to count, and that's the reason I'm here today. If we don't secure our federal elections, we will become a banana republic. It is right around the corner. The American people want it. The only question is, do my colleagues in the Senate want to keep the tradition of the Senate, or do they want to work for the American people? That's the reason we're here. Are we just interested in protecting our own power? I hope not, because it won't be here long if we don't. Let's do the right thing for the American taxpayers and pass the Save American Act. Our nation and the future of our kids and grandkids depend on it. Think about it. I yield the floor, Mr. President. I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsop-Brooks.